The story you're about to hear is a work of historical fiction, a piece of Southern Gothic created in the tradition of authors like William Faulkner. It is not a documented historical event. Colonel Alistair Blackwood and Blackwood Manor are inventions, and there is no record of this tale in any official archive. Instead, think of it as a dark legend, a story crafted from the very real brutality and injustices of post-Civil War America. It's a cautionary tale born from that violent era, exploring how extreme cruelty can write its own bloody end. In 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War, a decorated Georgia colonel found his pride shattered. His only daughter had been rejected as a potential bride 40 times, and he saw her as a worthless burden. So, he committed an act of unimaginable cruelty. To punish her, he gave her to the man he still considered his property, the strongest freedman working his land. But what the colonel intended as a brutal punishment to dehumanize his own flesh and blood ignited a chain of events no one saw coming. It led to a forbidden pregnancy, a violent confrontation, and a death that would forever stain the family's legacy. This is the story of how a tyrant's hate backfired, because while his daughter returned pregnant, he returned dead. If you're fascinated by the stories that hide in the shadows of official records, the kind of tales that feel like they should be true, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the dark truths we unearth. The year is 1868. The smoke from the Civil War has cleared, but in the heart of Georgia, the embers of old hatreds still glow. Here, on a sprawling cotton plantation called Blackwood Manor, Colonel Alistair Blackwood reigned over a crumbling kingdom. Before the war, his name meant something. It meant wealth, power, and respect. He was a man carved from granite and arrogance, who believed the world was built to serve his ambitions. But the Confederacy's defeat had been a personal amputation for Alistair. It didn't just steal his cause, it stole his sense of divine right. He was left with his land, his manor, and a burning resentment that soured the very air around him. His authority, once absolute, was now challenged by new laws he despised. The only thing that grew in the wake of the war was his cruelty, which he cultivated with the same care he once gave his cotton fields. The colonel's obsession, however, wasn't just with money. It was with legacy. He saw the Blackwood name as a dynasty that had to rise from the ashes. For that, he needed alliances, and alliances were forged through marriage. And this was the source of his singular, agonizing shame. His only child, Eleanor. Eleanor Blackwood was not the Southern belle her father wanted. She didn't have the delicate, corseted figure that charmed suitors. From a young age, she'd carried a heaviness that society, and most brutally her own father, called a curse. In the cruel words of the time, she was obese, a word the colonel spat like poison. But her weight was just a shield, a physical manifestation of a life lived in the shadow of her father's disappointment, built of flesh to protect a spirit starved of affection. She was a gentle, intelligent soul, with a quiet wit, but no one bothered to notice. She found more comfort in the manor's dusty library than its grand ballroom. Her only friends were characters in books who didn't judge her for the space she occupied. Her father saw her sharp mind as just another defect. A sharp mind in a dull vessel is a waste of God's effort, he'd declare, his words cutting deeper than any blade. Determined to forge his dynasty, the colonel began a relentless, humiliating campaign to marry her off when she turned 18. He paraded a line of suitors through Blackwood Manor, sons of other struggling plantation owners, opportunistic carpetbaggers, and aging widowers looking for a good name. One by one they came, and one by one they left. 40 times, the number became a local legend, a joke that followed the Blackwood name like a stray dog. 40 times, Eleanor was presented like livestock. 40 times she endured the appraising glances, the thinly veiled disgust, and the hollow excuses. The first was a desperate young man whose family plantation had burned down. He looked at Eleanor not as a woman, but as a sack of gold. But even his desperation had its limits. After a stiff, silent dinner, he claimed urgent business back home and was never seen again. The 10th, a wheezing merchant from Savannah, spent the evening talking about his late wife's delicate constitution while staring at Eleanor's full plate with open disapproval. He left the next morning. The 30th rejection was perhaps the cruelest. He was a handsome, arrogant young man who actually walked with Eleanor in the garden. For a moment she felt a flicker of hope. He spoke of poetry and art. Then he let his mask slip. "My father believes this union would be advantageous," he said, his eyes scanning her form. "But I must confess, I have an appreciation for aesthetics. A man must have something beautiful to gaze upon. I'm sure you understand." He bowed, and the rejection was complete. With each refusal, the colonel's fury grew. He didn't see his daughter's pain. He saw only his own. He saw 40 public declarations that the Blackwood name was no longer enough. Eleanor became the focal point of all his rage. She was no longer his daughter. She was his failure, his shame made flesh. He began to look at her with a chilling, calculating coldness, like a man deciding how to put down a diseased animal. The 40th rejection was the one that finally broke him, and in the flood of his rage, a monstrous idea began to take root. The 40th suitor was a brute of a man, a northerner who'd bought up foreclosed land with ruthless efficiency. He had a face like a clenched fist and hands that looked like they could snap a man's neck. He was, in the colonel's mind, a last resort, a man so devoid of breeding that he surely couldn't afford to be picky. The man, Mr. Silas Croft, arrived and surveyed Blackwood Manor with the cold eye of an auctioneer. He spent 2 days on the property, his gaze lingering more on the timber and fields than on Eleanor. On the 3rd morning, he met the colonel in his study. Eleanor waited in the hall, her hands trembling. She didn't want this man, but she was terrified of what another rejection would bring. The study door opened. Croft walked right past Eleanor without a word, without a glance, and left the manor. The colonel stood in the doorway, his face purple with rage, his body trembling. He turned his eyes on Eleanor, and the hatred in them was so pure it was like a physical force. "He said he would rather marry a workhorse," the colonel whispered, his voice dangerously low. "A workhorse," he said, "would be more pleasant to look at least be useful in the fields." He stepped toward her, his movements stiff and unnatural. 40, he hissed. 40 men have looked upon you and seen nothing of value. You are a blight, a stain on my name. You want a purpose? You want to be useful? Fine. I will give you a purpose. I will put you where you belong, with the other livestock." What happened next was a blur of horror. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and dragged her from the main house. He pulled her across the lawn that separated the world of the landowner from the world of the sharecropper, toward the small, crude cabins that housed the handful of freedmen and their families who remained, trapped by contracts and debts that were just another form of chain. People watched from the fields, their faces a mix of shock and fear, but no one dared to intervene. The colonel was a volcano of rage, and no one wanted to be caught in the lava. He stopped before a cabin slightly larger than the others, its wood weathered to a deep gray. This was the home of Cato. Cato was a man who seemed forged from the earth itself. He was tall and broad, his muscles honed by decades of relentless labor. He was known as the Colonel's Strongest, a title that was both a fact and a brand. Before the war, the Colonel would make Cato perform feats of strength for guests, a grotesque display of his finest property. But Cato's real strength was in his silence, a deep, quiet dignity that no amount of brutality had ever extinguished. He had endured the whip before emancipation, and he endured the Colonel's casual cruelty now. His eyes held a deep, ancient wisdom, the look of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen not to become a part of it. The Colonel kicked the cabin door open. Cato was inside, mending a leather harness. He looked up, his face impassive, as the Colonel shoved Eleanor into the small dark room. She stumbled and fell to the dirt floor. "She is yours now," the Colonel spat, his voice dripping with venom, his eyes fixed on his daughter. 40 gentlemen find her worthless. So she will learn her worth from my strongest buck. Use her as you see fit. Teach her what it means to be useful. Breed her for all I care. A strong back is more valuable than a pretty face, is it not? Perhaps she will finally produce something of value. In that moment, he stripped Eleanor of her name, her family, her very humanity. He was treating her like an object, and he was treating Cato like an animal, refusing to acknowledge the man's freedom. He looked from his terrified daughter on the floor to the silent, imposing figure of Cato, expecting fear or perhaps some grotesque gratitude. He saw neither. "You will not leave this cabin," the colonel snarled at Eleanor. "And you," he said to Cato, "will do as you are told." He slammed the door shut and dropped the wooden bar into place, sealing them inside. Eleanor was left in the dim light, shaking with sobs of terror and humiliation, alone in a cabin with a man her father had just given her to, like a piece of meat thrown to a dog. The colonel walked away, a grim satisfaction on his face, convinced he had finally solved the problem of his burdensome daughter. He could not have been more wrong. The first hours in the cabin were an eternity of suffocating silence, broken only by Eleanor's stifled sobs. The small space was overwhelmingly foreign, a world away from the silks and mahogany of her bedroom. It was sparse, a packed dirt floor, a rough-hewn table, a single stool, and a cot in the corner made of a straw-stuffed mattress. It smelled of earth, sweat, and a quiet resilience. Eleanor remained huddled on the floor, bracing for the violence her father had commanded. But nothing came. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic scrape of leather against metal as Cato resumed his work. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak to her. He granted her the dignity of his indifference, a courtesy her own father had never afforded her. As the sun began to set, casting long orange fingers of light through the cracks in the walls, he rose. Eleanor flinched. Cato walked to a small hearth, took a wooden bowl, filled it with a simple stew of greens and salted pork, and placed it on the floor a few feet from her. He then took his own portion and returned to his stool, eating in his characteristic silence. He had offered her food, a gesture so simple, so fundamentally human, it pierced through her terror with a shard of confusion. It was not the act of a brute, it was the act of a man. The first few days passed in this strange, silent truce. Eventually, driven by hunger, Eleanor ate the food he left for her. She slept on a pile of burlap sacks in the opposite corner, as far from his cot as possible. Cato never approached her. He left at dawn when the overseer unbarred the door for the day's labor and returned at dusk. Each night, he shared his meager meal with her before retreating into his own exhausted silence. Slowly, Eleanor's terror was replaced by a profound curiosity. She started to watch him. She watched his strong, calloused hands as they expertly mended tools. She saw not the buck her father described, but a craftsman, a survivor. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face, but she also saw an unyielding core of self-possession. One evening, about a week in, she spoke. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "Why?" she asked, looking at the bowl in her hands. Cato stopped chewing and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. His gaze wasn't threatening, it was just weary and perceptive. "Why what?" he asked, his voice a low baritone she'd never heard. "Why are you kind?" she managed to say. "My father, he told you to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Cato put his bowl down. "Your father is a cruel man," he said simply. "He thinks his cruelty is strength. He's wrong. It's a sickness. I will not be infected by his sickness, and I will not do his sick work for him." He paused. "He did not give me a woman. He gave me his daughter. He put his own blood in my house to be shamed. The shame is his, not yours, and not mine." His words hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. The shame is his. No one had ever said that to her. That night, a tentative dam broke. Eleanor began to talk about the books she read, about the worlds she visited in her mind. He listened, his silence no longer feeling like indifference, but like deep, absorbent attention. In return, he began to share parts of his world. He told her stories the elders passed down, tales of clever rabbits who outsmarted powerful bears. He taught her the names of the wild plants at the edge of the fields, which ones could be medicine and which could be food. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt seen. Cato didn't see a burden. He saw a person trapped in a cage, just as he was. Their bond was something deeper than romance. It was the recognition of two souls, both dehumanized by the same man, finding a shared humanity in a place designed to strip it from them. Eleanor began to change. The suffocating weight of her father's judgment started to lift. She learned to mend her own clothes, to help prepare their simple meals, finding a purpose in the daily acts of survival. She was becoming free, even within the four walls of that cabin. And in that shared space, in the quiet intimacy forged by circumstance, the inevitable happened. In a world that had offered them nothing but cruelty, they found a fragile, desperate tenderness in each other's arms. It was an act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the man who sought to control and degrade them both. This is the moment the Colonel's plan truly began to crumble. The punishment he designed to break his daughter was instead forging a connection he could never have imagined and planting the seeds of his own destruction. If you're gripped by this story of defiance, take a moment to like this video and share it. A few months later, Eleanor knew she was pregnant. The realization filled her with a terrifying, exhilarating mix of dread and hope. Her first thought was of her father, his rage, his obsession with bloodlines. A child, her child, conceived in a sharecropper's cabin with a man he considered less than human. It was a declaration of war. She told Cato one evening, her voice a tremor. He received the news with his usual calm, but she saw a deep, profound fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her, and for the life she carried. This child would be a death sentence for them all. But the Colonel had made a critical mistake. After locking his daughter away, he had tried to put her out of his mind. He assumed she was living in misery, her spirit broken. He never visited. He never asked after her. He just let her rot, or so he thought. But secrets on a plantation are like water. They seep through everything. Whispers began to spread. A house servant saw a change in Eleanor through the cabin window. A field hand mentioned Cato was no longer alone. The whispers grew into a murmur that finally flowed back to the main house. It was the overseer, a sycophantic man named Miller, who finally brought the news. He found Alistair on the veranda, staring out at his fields with dead eyes, a glass of bourbon in his hand. "Colonel," Miller began, "there's talk about your daughter." The Colonel's eyes narrowed. "What talk?" "They're saying she's with child," Miller said, taking a step back. The world seemed to stop. The chirping of crickets went silent in the Colonel's mind. He had given his daughter away to be broken. He had intended to humiliate her. But for her to exist, bearing the fruit of that union, it was the ultimate humiliation for him. His plan hadn't just backfired, it had detonated, and he was at the epicenter. The Blackwood bloodline, his sacred obsession, would now be mixed with that of a man he still saw as subhuman. The rage that overcame Alistair Blackwood wasn't rational. It was the primal fury of a tyrant who had lost control. He rose from his chair, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and murderous intent. "Where is she?" he roared. "In the cabin, sir. With him," Miller stammered. The Colonel stormed into the house and emerged moments later. In his hand he held a heavy leather whip. Tucked into his waistband was the cold, metallic glint of a pistol. He wasn't going to punish. He was going to erase. The Colonel marched toward the quarters, each step a hammer blow against the packed earth. He was a man possessed, a specter of pure vengeance. He was no longer the master of Blackwood Manor. He was an executioner on his way to an appointment. Inside, Eleanor and Cato had heard the Colonel's roar. They knew he was coming. There was nowhere to run. The door was barred from the outside. They were trapped. Cato moved to stand in front of Eleanor, shielding her with his body. She grabbed his arm. For the first time, she didn't cower. The quiet dignity she had learned from him had forged a new spine of steel within her. The bar was ripped away, and the door flew open. The Colonel stood silhouetted in the doorway, a monstrous figure against the moonlight. His chest was heaving, his eyes bloodshot. "So it is true," he breathed, his gaze falling on Eleanor. He saw her standing, not huddled in shame, and he saw the undeniable curve of her belly beneath her simple dress. The sight shattered the last of his sanity. "You whore!" he screamed. "You have befouled my name with this filth!" He lunged into the cabin, raising the whip. "I will scourge this abomination from you." The whip whistled through the air, aimed at his daughter. But Cato was faster. He moved with impossible speed, intercepting the blow with his forearm. The leather cracked against his flesh, but he didn't flinch. Stunned by this open defiance, the Colonel stumbled back. "You dare!" he shrieked. "You dare lay a hand on me, you animal!" "She is not for you to harm anymore," Cato said, his voice a low rumble of thunder before the storm. She is my property. You are my property, the colonel raged. He dropped the whip, his hand going for the pistol. I will put you both down like the dogs you are. As he drew the weapon, Eleanor screamed, a scream not of fear, but of pure rage. No, she cried, throwing herself between him and Cato. You will not touch him. You will not touch our child. The colonel froze, pistol halfway raised, his mind unable to process it. His obese, worthless daughter was defending the freedmen and the child they had created. It was a complete inversion of his world. That hesitation was all Cato needed. He was not a violent man, but he was a survivor. For a lifetime he had held his strength in check, absorbing punishment. Now he was fighting for Eleanor, for their unborn child, for the fragile, beautiful thing they had built in the heart of all this ugliness. He lunged, not at the gun, but at the colonel himself, slamming into him with the force of a battering ram. The colonel, a man softened by privilege, was no match for Cato's raw power. The pistol went off, the shot tearing a hole in the ceiling. The two men crashed to the floor. The colonel gasped, trying to bring the pistol around, but Cato's hands were on him. One hand clamped down on the colonel's wrist, and with a sickening crack, the bone snapped. The pistol fell. The colonel screamed, a thin sound of agony. You broke my arm! You savage! Cato's other hand was at the colonel's throat. He leaned in close, and the lifetime of silent rage he had suppressed finally found a voice. You did this, Cato whispered, his voice deadly calm. You brought this hate into my house. You thought your power made you a god, but you are just a man, a weak, cruel man. And your cruelty has come home. The colonel clawed at Cato's hand, his eyes bulging as he realized his power meant nothing here. He was no longer Colonel Alistair Blackwood. He was just a man, fighting for breath and losing. With a final decisive clench, Cato squeezed. There was a faint snap. The colonel's body went limp, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Silence. Cato slowly released his grip and pushed himself up. He looked down at the body of the man who had owned him, tormented him, and in a final act of hubris, delivered his own death warrant. Eleanor stared, her hand covering her mouth. Her father, the tyrant who had haunted her entire existence, was gone. He lay still and broken on the dirt floor of a sharecropper's cabin. The punishment had been returned to its sender. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of a world turned upside down. Cato stood over the body, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a cold, stark reality. Eleanor slowly lowered her hand. There was no grief in her eyes, only shock, and beneath it, the first, fragile flicker of freedom. They both knew this wasn't the end. The gunshot would have been heard. The colonel's absence would be noted by morning. When a white landowner's body was found in a black man's cabin, there would be no trial, only a manhunt and a rope. We have to go, Cato said, his voice pulling Eleanor from her trance. Now! There was no time to pack, nothing to take. He took Eleanor's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. He led her out of the cabin, and they melted into the woods that bordered the property. The forest that had always been their prison boundary now became their only path to salvation. They traveled by night and hid by day, surviving on Cato's knowledge of the land. Eleanor, who once struggled to walk through a garden, now trekked through miles of wilderness. With every step she took away from Blackwood Manor, she felt the suffocating weight of her old life fall away. She was no longer the colonel's daughter. She was Eleanor, a survivor, a woman about to become a mother, walking toward an unknown dawn with the man who had shown her what it meant to be free. Back at the manor, the official story was a tragic accident. The colonel, drunk, must have stumbled and fallen. His daughter and his strongest worker? They must have taken the opportunity to flee. No one in power was interested in the truth. The idea that a freedman had killed his former master to protect the master's own daughter was too dangerous to even contemplate. But the truth didn't die. It lived on in whispers among the other workers who had heard the screaming and seen the colonel's march to the cabin. And so the story of the colonel, his daughter, and the strong man named Cato was born. It wasn't found in any newspaper, but it was told in quiet corners, passed down, a cautionary tale for the cruel and a story of hope for the oppressed. It became a piece of folklore, a Southern Gothic legend that reminded people that even the most powerful tyrant builds his throne on a foundation that can crack. What became of Eleanor and Cato? Their story vanishes into the great, unwritten history of the thousands who sought freedom in the chaos of Reconstruction. Some say they made it north. Others say they found a secluded piece of land deep in the mountains and founded a new life. The most hopeful telling is that their child was born free and never knew the name Alistair Blackwood. The tale of Blackwood Manor is brutal, but it holds an unyielding truth. Cruelty is a seed that bears violent fruit. Colonel Alistair Blackwood believed his power was absolute, that he could dehumanize and discard people, including his own blood. But justice, when denied a righteous path, often carves its own bloody channel. This story, while fiction, serves as a stark reminder that a person's worth is never determined by the judgment of others, and that the strength to endure is often surpassed by the strength required to finally say, "No more." The colonel wanted to punish his daughter for the shame she brought him. In the end, his own actions delivered a final, fatal shame that buried his name in an unmarked grave of dark legend. For more stories from the dark and forgotten corners of history, tales of rebellion and consequence that official records chose to ignore, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts on this story in the comments below.